Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the work that has been going on here at CBS about transformation of healthcare, especially with the use of AI. So I thought that I would start by setting a level field and starting with a couple of data points. So you've probably heard the first one. Healthcare is incredibly expensive. Worldwide, healthcare expenditures comprise 10% of GDP, and here within the US, that number is much higher, it's 18%. And there have been massive efforts to try to reduce costs, improve access and quality of care, and it's been very challenging over the last couple of decades. But I'm here to share with you that we're really on the cusp of transformation. And where is that coming from? It's coming from data and AI. So some other facts that are maybe interesting to you. A single hospital in 1 year generates around 50 petabytes of data. And this doesn't even include all the data that every single one of you are collecting daily with your devices and wearables. And so the rate at which healthcare data is growing is astronomical. And yet, a tiny percentage of that data is being used. Only 3% of that data is actually being utilized to reduce costs, improve access, and quality. Only 6% of hospitals claim to have any sort of AI strategy. And so while all of this data is coming to the forefront, and while it has yet to be tapped, we really are starting to see this shift as people are becoming more open to data and more open to AI. So for me, as a faculty in the Decision Risk and Operations division, a lot of the questions that I think about is, if we want to utilize AI and we want to utilize predictive analytics to improve healthcare, how do we do this? How do we actually operationalize these decisions? And what benefits do we hope to be able to see? So I wanted to give you a concrete example of where we might be able to utilize these types of tools. And it is in the context of hospitals, and specifically the emergency department. Most hospitals have what we refer to as surge plans. So when demand exceeds supply of resources, physicians, nurses, beds, etc., hospitals will enact surge plans. There's a whole bunch of different things that come into play, one of which is bringing in additional staff. So this can be done by asking your current staff to work overtime. It could be calling in agency staff that kind of float around and complement your full-time staff. And so what we were looking at is, how can real-time information and predictions help us make these types of decisions? First, is there value to having this real-time information? Can our predictions improve at all? And second, if they do, how do we actually make decisions based on the predictions that we're getting? So to give you a little context of how some staffing decisions are made, there's essentially 2 time periods. At the first one, which is done weeks or months in advance, we want to determine what the base staffing level is. Think of this as how many FTEs you want to hire. And the benefit of this is being paid at your base rate. The challenge is you're making this decision well in advance before you actually know what the demands are of patients. Then you can wait for time to evolve, and it's right before shift begins. And you suddenly realize there is a line of patients out the door, and you don't have enough staff to be able to handle that. And so you can call in additional staffing, but you have to pay them a premium. You have to pay them overtime or additional rates to actually entice them to come in on those short notice. But the benefit is you have a lot more information about what's happening right now. Let me give you a little intuition about that real-time information and why it can be helpful. Every winter, we know that we are going to have to suffer through flu. But what we don't know is how bad the flu season is going to be today. We don't know what next year's flu season is going to look like. And so this is data from the CDC that shows how many patients in the US were hospitalized with the flu each year. One thing you'll note is there's massive variation. COVID is basically zero during 2020, 2021. But you may or may not remember, in 2017 and 2018, it was a particularly bad flu season. Actually, here in New York, some hospitals were opening up tents next to their hospital to accommodate all the patients that were coming in. This past flu season that we're coming out of was also quite bad. Now, we know that flu is going to happen in that December-February time period. We don't know in May how bad it's going to be. But once you're in it, you know, right? You know how many people around you have the flu, and you can account and incorporate that information, that real-time information, in your staffing decisions. So what we did here was we built a framework to establish a protocol to do nurse staffing. We built a two-stage prediction model that used information months in advance, and then at the surge stage, we used real-time prediction, including things like how many patients are with the flu today in our emergency department, how many people are searching on Google, do I have flu? Because everybody seems to do that first. The next thing we did is, based on these predictions and knowing we had this information, can we come up with a staffing protocol to actually guide the decisions? We build a model to do this. It has a number of features. It's easy to calculate. It has interpretation that lends itself when we're convincing staffing, the nurse staff, to incorporate our protocol of why we are making the recommendations we are. And we're able to show that it has really strong performance, in fact, near optimal performance. And then what we did was we actually ran an implementation at Hackensack Meridian across the river in New Jersey, where each morning we would send to the nursing managing team an email with our predictions of how many patients are going to show up in the next 24 hours and our recommendations on how many nurses they should staff in each period. So what did we find by doing this? I won't go into all the details of the statistics. We looked at a number of different outcome measures of access. So I'll go from the right to the left. Left without being seen. These are individuals that show up at the emergency department, are waiting. They wait too long, they get frustrated, and they decide to go home because they waited too long and they didn't get access. Unfortunately, many of those patients do end up coming back to the hospital. But we can see with our implementation, there was actually no impact on patients who left without being seen. We also see for patients the amount of time they spend in the emergency department and how much time they spend waiting. There was no significant effect whatsoever. But we found that there was a reduction of staffing costs by having our recommendation available. We estimate that if this was translated across an entire year, this would result in $1.4 million in savings without any impact on quality or access. And so here's where the opportunities really lie with AI, leveraging the information and data that is available to us to be able to make smart decisions, utilizing the resources that are available so we can make sure that they are there when the patients that need it are showing up. So I hope that this gives you just a small little example of how AI can be used to what we like to refer to in the healthcare space as the triple aim. This is kind of the holy grail of what we want to get, which is better access to care, lower costs, and improved quality. So thank you, all of you, for being here, and I look forward to chatting with you later.
Let's talk about climate change. I'm going to talk about the fear of climate change, and that's a downer part. I'm also going to talk the hope that I have about climate change, and maybe at the end of this 10-minute talk, it'll be less of a downer talk. So let me start with the basics. I think you're all familiar with this. Just want to make sure we level set here. Over the last 2,000 years, humanity has had a very steady amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The Industrial Revolution comes along about 200 years ago. We build a global economy that produces incredible prosperity in terms of food and housing and transportation. We've created this modern miracle, but there's a catch, because that modern economy is all based on emitting greenhouse gases. And the problem with that, of course, is that as greenhouse gas concentrations go up, the planet is warming. This is the greenhouse effect. It's very well understood and known. And we see that in the last 3 years are the 3 warmest years in the history of modern humans. And in fact, last year we breached the 1.5 degree mark. In other words, we are now 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than we were historically, using the baseline of 1850 to 1900. But when it comes to climate change, the past doesn't really matter. What really matters is the future. Where are we headed? Because that's where the problem lies. And when we look to the future, we can make all sorts of predictions. First of all, what future would be ideal? Well, the climate scientists tell us, many of whom work here at Columbia University, they're very clear about this. The science is very clear. If we want to avoid any risk of catastrophic climate change, we need to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In other words, where we are today. And the only way we can do that is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to zero, or what's called net zero, within the next 30 to 50 years. And this has been the objective of the Paris Agreement, politicians and policymakers and scientists for several decades now. This is not going to happen. We are not going to keep things to 1.5 degrees. In fact, the moment where we're headed is a warming of more than 2 degrees, but 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius. That's the direction we're headed today. So what does that mean for us? What's that future of 2.5, 2.9 degrees look like? Well, it's not good. First, in some parts of the world, for example, parts of India, we're already seeing temperatures in the spring get above 40 degrees Celsius, well above 40 degrees Celsius today. That's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And this starts to get beyond the human survivability index. In other words, people will not survive there. They'll have to move. We'll have a greater migration problem that we already have. We're going to have challenges in parts of the world to live. We're going to see more intense storms. Why is that? Because most of the heat that's been accumulated, this warming, is actually not in the atmosphere. It's in the oceans. The oceans absorb most of the energy in the warming. And when storms are created in the Atlantic and other oceans, what they're drawing on the energy in the water. They're taking up the heat that's in the oceans. As the oceans warm, there's more energy, more violent storms. We're starting to see that in the southeast and the south of the US. That trend will accelerate. There'll be more powerful storms in our future. We will see more wildfires, more intense wildfires, not because it's hotter out there, it's only a couple degrees hotter, but because when it warms, forests get drier. They dry out with a couple degrees. And when they dry out, they become tinderboxes and you get fires. Like we saw in LA, of course, the Palisades fire, a very costly fire to the economy and to the people there. But in fact, that was a very small wildfire. The big wildfires are going to be in Canada and other places that have enormous forests that are drying out. So we're going to see increasing wildfires. And if you really want to talk about fear, we need to think about what I call tipping points. Tipping points are when there's a change in the natural environment that's abrupt, and once it happens, it's almost impossible to reverse it, and it leads to further changes in the climate. An example of this, and there are many potential tipping points out there, I just show you one, is the permafrost. So permafrost is permanently frozen land in northern Canada, northern Russia, and that land stores enormous amounts of methane. It's frozen vegetative matter from millions of years ago in some cases, or sometimes just a few thousand years ago. But it's frozen. That's great. Leave it frozen. As the planet warms, that permafrost thaws. As it thaws, methane gets released. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. That leads to further warming. Further warming, more permafrost melts, more methane released. That's a tipping point. That hasn't happened yet, but 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius, the risk of tipping points becomes much greater. So we have a lot to worry about when it comes to climate change and our future if we're heading down a path of 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius. But this talk is about fear and hope. What's there to be hopeful about? Well, let's start with the fact that we sit here in a business school, and the area I specialize is in climate finance. And the first thing I'm hopeful about is the amount of finance, or specifically investment, that is going into climate solutions. We recently started investing more capital in clean energy alone, mostly renewable energy, than in all fossil fuels everywhere on the planet. Coal, natural gas, oil. We now pour more money into solar, wind, and other clean technologies. This is a dramatic change. The amount of capital flowing globally has increased dramatically. And while politics will affect that, certainly here in the US in the next couple of years, the trend is very, very clear. A lot more capital is going into solutions. Why is capital going into these solutions? You'd say, well, because of climate change. Not exactly. It's going to these solutions because they're innovative. The amount of innovation that's happening here is extraordinary. Number one, solar. Solar is one of the great inventions of modern humanity. The cost of producing electricity from solar has declined 99.9% in the last couple of decades. This incredible accomplishment to the point where producing electricity from solar is now the cheapest way of generating power on the planet. And as a result, the amount of solar and wind that's generating electricity today is the fastest growing source of power generation on the planet. Let me put this in context. When I got involved with climate change, which is now more than 2 decades ago, we go back to 2001 when I got involved, and if you took every solar panel on the planet and added them all together, they produce as much electricity as one coal-fired plant. Today, globally, we install as much solar in 12 hours as one coal-fired plant. Every 12 hours, we're replacing a coal-fired plant. So this is a remarkable innovation, and it's changing the trajectory of energy generation on the planet. Another example of innovation, of course, is batteries. A colleague of mine at the engineering school said, I never knew batteries could be so sexy. Turns out they are, because batteries allow us to have electrified transportation and to use renewable energy to drive our transportation. And the cost of batteries is also coming down remarkably, because that's resulting in a dramatic increase in electric vehicles. Last year in China, which is the largest automobile market in the planet, more than 50% of all new cars sold in China now are electric vehicles. There's an incredibly fast transition happening from the internal combustion engine to the electric vehicle. Why? Because the innovation around these cars. These are not just cleaner cars than traditional gasoline-powered. They are better cars. They're faster. They're more fun to drive, cheaper to operate. Enormous innovation there. If we move from power and transportation, the areas that are probably well known, to the area of industry, there are now thousands of companies with thousands of innovations under development today. And many of these are going to be enormously successful in the future. I'm not saying they're all going to be, and many of these companies, of course, will fail over time. But you've got companies working on things like green hydrogen, green steel, producing steel without greenhouse gas emissions. You've got enhanced geothermal. Enhanced geothermal is leveraging existing technologies in the oil and gas industry, fracking, to generate clean, almost anywhere on the planet that's cheap. And I was meeting with a venture capitalist yesterday to discuss this sector. This sector may become as large as the solar sector in the next decade. You have other technologies, basic things like cement, which is now increasingly green or low-carbon cement, to high-tech technologies like fusion. The world's leading fusion companies here in the US. The CEO came and spoke here recently, Commonwealth Fusion. So you have an incredible amount of innovation going on, and that gives me hope, because when I started in this sector, not only was solar a tiny little solution, none of this innovation existed then. We knew the science of climate change 20 years ago. We knew the problem. We didn't have the solutions. So where does that leave us? How do you pull together this fear and hope that I've just expressed? How do you balance these two? Well, let me summarize this. The challenge we face, as I started my talk with, is that we spent 200 years growing this global economy, this extraordinary thing we've created, We now have about 30 years to decarbonize that economy. We need to figure out how to have economic growth and decouple it from greenhouse gas emissions. That's the only path that's feasible going forward. Okay? Can we do that? Can we balance that fear and hope? And it turns out we already have examples of doing so. One example is the United Kingdom. The UK economy decoupled back in the 90s. Okay? And I picked that as an example, not because they're the only example or the best example. The UK economy hasn't grown tremendously in the last couple of decades, but it has grown significantly. And emissions, absolute emissions, these are not per capita emissions, absolute emissions have gone down. I picked the UK because this whole problem started in the UK. The Industrial Revolution started in the UK. They were the first to burn coal. And they did something amazing. In 2024, they burnt their last ton of coal to produce power. There's no more coal-fired facilities in the UK, and their economy continues to grow. Okay, that's great. UK is not such a big economy. Can we in the US decouple greenhouse gas emissions from economic growth? Is that possible? Well, it's a trick question. I like trick questions for my students in class, right? It's a trick question because we already did it. We have decoupled emissions and economic growth starting in 2007. The US economy has grown very dramatically in that period, and emissions have actually declined in that period. Okay? Not fast enough to avoid the climate challenge we face, but there is a clear decoupling there. So the last point I'll make is what's happening in the US and the UK and many other countries is good. It's not good enough. But it's also not the most important region. The most important country by far when it comes to climate is China. 1/3 of all emissions in the world today are from China. So where's China in all this? China has not decoupled. China's emissions have gone up every year except when there's something weird happens to the world, like COVID. With the COVID crisis, the economy drops, emissions. You see that in the slide. But something might be about to change in China. The early data, and we're not sure about this data yet, but the early data suggests that Chinese emissions peaked last year. This would be an incredible thing, because if Chinese emissions finally peak, in other words, they finally decouple, they still have economic growth, but their emissions start to drop, then you've finally got the last big country emitting, starting to get on the path to decoupling their economy and addressing our change. So where are we headed? We're not headed to 1.5 degrees. We're going to warm more. I also don't think we're headed to 2.5 to 2.9 degrees and the catastrophic scenarios I'd explain. I think we're somewhere in the middle. Because of the innovation, because of the investment, because of what's happening globally, we're probably going to be somewhere around 1.8 to 2.1 degrees. That's not a great outcome. That's not even a good outcome. But it's definitely a manageable outcome, and that's probably the future we're facing. Thank you very much.
I want to begin my presentation today by telling you about the MIT Media Lab. The MIT Media Lab is a research institute at MIT focused on applying technology to social interactions. It was founded by Sandy Pentland, and he's also director of the Human Dynamics Lab. In 2020, 2 startups came out of the MIT Media Lab, specifically from the lab from Sandy Pentland. One of them was called Ginger.io. Ginger.io was founded by Anmol Madan and Karen Singh. Karen Singh was an MBA and doctor connecting with Anmol at MIT, and what they were doing was triangulating cell phone data and how you used it to try to predict people's mental health needs. At the same time, a separate company, Sociometric Solutions, founded by Ben Weber and Danielle Elgin, also graduates from the lab, hope to triangulate also, in this case, social badges rather than cell phone data to understand how organizations work. Today, these companies, even though they look so similar initially, have ended up with diametrically different outcomes. Ginger.io had 200 employees, raised $200 million, and eventually merged with Headspace, creating a $3 billion company. It is a big success. Sociometric Solutions only has 13 employees, and in 2022, they had to raise a down round, meaning they dropped their valuation, and the equity of the founders was complete, after 12 years of work, was completely wiped out. They are, what we call in business school, a learning opportunity. And so, what I've been trying to figure out at Columbia, one of the main questions that keeps puzzling me is, how can it be that two companies that are so similar, companies that are in the same industry, in the same location, with the same mentors, coming from the same university, and targeting basically the same market problem, can end up with such different outcomes? Now, one possible answer is that it's just random, right? Look, a lot of randomness happens in startup outcomes, but we also know that's not the only part of the story. We know from management that there's something else going on. A separate answer might come from your time here, where you want to think about the competitive advantage. And that's what you learn in your class strategy formulation, where, if you might remember, you talk about companies like Walmart and Disney, and you talk about how Walmart's competitive advantage came from its cost leadership and economies of scale, and Disney's competitive advantage came from its ability to manage multiple activities within the scope of the company. But what happened was that, as I was trying to think about why Ginger.io fared differently than sociometric solutions, and deep dive into the story of these two companies, cost leadership, economies of scale, economies of scope did not seem to answer the question. But rather, the best answer one could find was about the founders themselves. If you look at the team, for example, they're both similar teams, but they have a few differences. The first team, Ginger.io, is a complementary team. There is a innovator, Anmol Madan, who's partnering with an MBA that's bringing the business acumen, and at the same time, he's a medical doctor, and so he has an understanding of the mental health space. Sociometric solution, rather than being complementary, is more redundant. Both founders are coming from the same background of being PhD engineers. They're also a little bit different on the technology they brought. At Ginger.io, Anmol Madan had brought technology for which he had been the sole developer at MIT, and he had been the leading in conceptualizing this technology. Sociometric solutions, they had also participated in creating a technology at MIT, but they were actually not the inventors alone, but they had just been part of a broader team. And in fact, when I went back to think about these companies, Disney and Walmart, I realized that the same story about founders being critical could be said about their competitive advantage early on. For example, the impact of Walt Disney on Disney is actually remarkable, right? He invented a new animation approach. He was the first to decide you could create full-length feature films. He created the characters we love today, and he was the first to invest in theme parks. He also brought tremendous work ethic. He said, well, people ask me if I know the secret to success, and I could tell others how to make their dreams come true. He said, my answer is, you do it by working. The same story about a very consequential founder being, at the beginning, so important for the company could be said about Walmart. And so as I ask myself this question, and I wonder, why do some companies really succeed while the other ones fail? Perhaps, I wonder, right, could it be that a person, rather than the company, is the competitive advantage? Does this make sense, that a person would be the competitive advantage? And I kept pondering on this until 2023, when evidence came in favor of these hypotheses. What happened was, some colleagues of mine went and looked at used census data to look at every company in the United States. And they identified the founders and the early stage employees. And then, to look at the effect of the founders, they looked at those that died unexpectedly. People that die in car accidents when you never knew, people that have a heart attack but they're like below 45, things like that. And they said, what happens to the company when the founder leaves unexpectedly? And they saw that the performance of the company drops and drops permanently. In fact, even when you compare it to early employees that joined within the first year and that are also there from the beginning, the importance of the founders is much more substantial. And so that suggests that founders, indeed, are quite critical, in understanding the advantage of the company. So the question is why? There's a lot that we don't know as to why. There's a lot of reasons that one can conjure, but I want to tell you two for which we have some evidence, at least. One of them is that founders embody that unique thesis of the startup that eventually builds into that competitive advantage. And I told you these examples already. Perhaps where we have a little bit more evidence is in thinking about academic science and its process of commercialization. Because there we can look at, in universities, we can look that are creating net new science. We can ask ourselves, what happens when the science is licensed to a startup and then tries to grow it? And what happens when that science, rather than just being licensed to a startup, works through a startup where the founder was also the inventor, right? Does that make sense? And we see that inventor founders actually turn out to be quite more beneficial. They have higher equity outcomes. These startups have more coherence between the technology and business problem and are able to solve multiple challenges that founders confront, such as hiring, issues of geography isolation, organizational growth, etc. We also know that founders bring up a lot of something you might call entrepreneurial leadership, which first of all means working very hard, right? When you ask entrepreneurs and salaried people how much time do they work, entrepreneurs report working a lot longer. When you actually use time journal data collected by the census, where you track in 15-minute increments what somebody does throughout their whole day, that also turns out to be true. Entrepreneurs are found to just spend a lot more hours working, and this extra time leads to higher income. Entrepreneurs are eternal optimists, right? And optimism is very positive for the firm. First of all, it allows them to focus on long-term investments because you believe things are going to be around in the future. Second, it allows people to join in shared commitments. If you have uncertainty whether to join a startup, whether to invest in a startup, whether to be part of that, it means a lot to know that the central person in that company is really going at it with their full heart. And that means that I, as an employee, will have a better payoff joining this company. And this optimism also makes them believe they have what it takes to make to get the necessary work done. And so as I thought about this company and I thought about all these features that made, as I thought about this question, and I thought about all these features that made these two companies very similar, I realized that maybe the question was poorly formed. Because even though the companies were very similar, they had very different founding teams. And that maybe it was this difference in the founding teams that determined the startup's competitive advantage. And in fact, as I thought about that, it made me think back again to strategy formulation. Because all of those that took strategy formulation, at least since I've been here, might remember a figure that looks a little bit like this, right? Where we talk about Disney and we talk about all the different verticals that Disney is in, and we realize that that's only made sense because something brought them together. In that case, it was the characters, but we said, there's something about core resources that can bring those together. They bring coherence to something that is difficult to understand, and they're particularly useful on their moments of high uncertainty. And the same could be said about founders. That it is the founders themselves that are the core resource that determine a startup's competitive advantage. That it is through that all the other things and that you later see, right? The scale, the commercialization strategy, the IP, actually come, in many cases, from that initial founder difference. And so what would you take from this in terms of managerial takeaway, if you're looking for one? Well, the other takeaway that you might have is that founders are important. They're the core resource creating the company's advantage. But also, this means that if you're wondering if you should start a company, and you have a small edge, and you're willing to work hard and be optimistic about it, the rest of the competitive advantage will develop or can develop around that effort and vision that you're bringing as the rest of the company. And so rather than waiting for all of that to be there, you might have enough to already get started. Thank you.
I actually have a background in psychology and computer science, so I think of myself in really living in these two different worlds. One is the messy world of human behavior, desires, preferences, motivations, and needs, combined with this somewhat more cold and structured world of math, equations, and most recently, AI. And what excites me the most about this intersection is that we can really try to leverage the data that we generate pretty much every single day, combined with tools like machine learning, AI, to both understand, predict, and change human behavior and human psychology. And kind of that is like pretty broadly construed, ranging anywhere from people's personality, their personal values, their mental health, really getting a sense of who is the person behind the data that is generated. And when I started this research, well, more than 10 years ago now, I did it in what I would call the old school world of machine learning. So the world where you train a model for a very specific task. I could tell it, I could teach it to take your credit card spending and predict whether you're more extroverted or introverted. And what we know, and then we just have it run through a lot of trial and error rounds. Right? Over time, it understands how to associate the input with the output. And what we've learned is that machines are extremely good at solving these tasks. Right? They're really good at recognizing patterns in vast amounts of data, but it was very limited in terms of the opportunities when it comes to applications. And that's just because the models that we used to train, they were, first of all, dependent on you having a data set that combines psychology with, let's say, digital footprints, credit card spending, social media data, browsing histories. And they were also very limited in what they could do. So if I had trained a model to predict your extroversion from credit card spending, my model might have turned out great. But the moment that I want to predict something else, right, the moment that I want to predict whether you might be neurotic or impulsive, or I have a different data source instead of credit card spending, I now have access to your social media, that model was entirely useless because it's never been trained to solve that task. Now, fast forward to the introduction of what I would call the new world of AI, the new world of machine learning, in the form of these transformer models. And you probably know them in the context of large language models, the likes of ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, and so on. And when you think about them, at the core, they were trained for a very, very basic, simple task. Right? They were trained to predict the most likely next word in a sentence. It doesn't get much simpler than that. And yet, what I'm hoping to convince you is that they can do so much more than just generate text and model language. So it's almost like a misnomer to call them language models, because when we think of language, we think of modeling grammar, maybe semantics. But what I will show you is that really give us an edge when it comes to understanding psychology, predicting, and potentially also changing behavior. And I want to start with these very simple examples that give you some intuitions of what I mean by this. If I give ChatGPT a sentence like, I left Seattle, and after about 3 hours of driving north, I crossed the border with, now this is the interactive part that you've all been dreading all day long. There's not going to be any cold calling in this one. You're going to cross the border with Canada, right? But for the model to actually put this word there, it needs to simulate something about our physical space, right? Because our narratives, the data that these models are trained on, they contain information of how we think about the physical space. These models also learn how to model and simulate physical space. Now, you can take it a step further and say, well, American restaurants are known for their, could be anything, burgers, fries, you name it. But for the model, again, to put that word there, it needs to use liberally, understand, know something about society, know something about culture, but it needs to know that, well, American restaurants serve food that's different to German restaurants, Asian restaurants, and so on and so forth. You can take it a step further, and this is where my interests lie, is if you give it a sentence like, Sam hates oats, but he's still forced to eat some, he probably feels disgusted, right? Because I make him eat something that he doesn't like. So this is telling you something about a psychological process. It's telling you something about the model understanding something about human feelings. If you give it an addition to the sentence, well, Betty hates Adam, so seeing him having to eat the oats makes her feel really happy. On the other hand, Jen loves Adam, so she feels somewhat sad about him having to go through this experience, right? Again, the model was trained to predict the next word in a sentence, but by doing so, by understanding human narrative, it also understands something about the underlying psychological processes that are happening. And here's one of my favorite examples of some recent research that is essentially really kind of showing how these algorithms can understand, again, used somewhat liberally, can simulate what is happening in terms of like human psychology. So this is a classic experimental setup in psychology where you have three items in a room. You have a box, you have a cat, and you have a basket. Also in the room happens to be Gustis and me. So that the two of us are in the room, and we have these three items. Now what happens is Gustis takes the cat, and he puts it in the basket, Then he leaves, because he's busy and his stuff to do. While Costis is away, I pick up the cat, and I move it to the box. And now I leave. Costis comes back, and now 2 questions. First one, where's the cat? This is the interactive part. Where's the cat? The box, right? So I put it in the box before I left. Now, the more interesting question is like, where is Costis going to look for the cat? The basket. So this answer, again, you're like, duh, of course it's the basket. This is an answer that comes to you intuitively, it comes to you automatically and instinctively, but it's actually pretty remarkable what's lying behind this answer. And it's something that we call theory of mind. The fact that as you go through life, you actually not only simulate your own reality, you actually simulate the reality of the people around you, right? So you understand that, well, when I moved the cat from the basket to the box, Costis wasn't in the room, so he simply doesn't know. And again, for you, it's so easy and so intuitive that we oftentimes don't appreciate just how remarkable that ability is. But if I tell you that my son here, Ben, who is 16 months old, he's not going to be able to solve any of these theory of mind problems until he's around 3 to 4 years old. He won't still be able to reliably solve them until he's about 9 years old. Otherwise, extremely intelligent species like chimps, dolphins, can't solve these problems at all. And we know that it's actually a hallmark of autism, for example, that people can still reason through these problems. If they sketch it out on a piece of paper, they can still come up with the correct answer, but it doesn't come as automatically and intuitively. So it really seems to be like one of these hallmark abilities of human psychology and human behavior that we can put ourselves in the shoes of other people. Now, the fascinating part is these problems are stories, right? These problems are narrative. I told you about the cat and the basket and me and Costis, and because they're based on language, we can actually give the same problem to these large language models and see how they do. So take a GPT, this was before ChatGPT was out in 2020, and you just give it the story, right? The same story that I told you, I give it to ChatGPT and I ask, where is the cat? So 2020, ChatGPT comes up with the answer, the cat is in the room, so far so good, it's in the basket. It doesn't even understand reality, right? It doesn't even understand the sequence of actions that the cat is now in the box because that's where I left it. So completely fails at the task. Fast forward 2 years, 2022, GPT-3 Da Vinci, give it the same task, where's the cat? The cat is in a box, so far so good. And where's Costis going to look for the cat? In the box. Where else, right? I, as the model, know the cat is in the box. Why on earth would Costis look anywhere else other than the box? So again, it understands reality now, but it still can't engage in the second step of like, yeah, someone else might have a different belief to what I understand and I know. Now, perhaps not surprising, you can see where this is going. ChatGPT-4, which is still, by the way, much, much smaller than the human brain in terms of the number of neurons and number of connections. You give it a task, where's the cat? Cat is in a box, yay. Where's Costis going to look for the cat? And now this is the first time that the model actually gets it right consistently. So in this case, Costis is most likely going to look for the cat in the basket first. So it also explains its reasoning because that's where he left it before going to work. And for me, this is really like one of the reasons for why I think LLMs are so much more than just language models, right? They're essentially extremely powerful human simulation machines. They are able to understand the world from the perspective of different people simply because they've read so much about human narrative. And in human narratives, we talk about geography, we talk about human emotions, we talk about cultural elements. And that's something that these LLMs have simply absorbed in the way that they were built. And now coming back to this notion of what does it mean for our ability to understand human psychology based on data? What I can do with any off-the-shelf LLM, again, your ChatGPT, your Claude, your Gemini, is I can simply give it access and say, hey, here's the social media posts, here's the credit card spending, here are the Google searches of a person. Why don't you tell me if this person is more extroverted, more introverted? What are their personal values? What do you think is their potential political ideology? Are they struggling with any mental health issues? And even though those models have never been explicitly trained to make those predictions, they're extremely good at understanding the person behind the data, right? So they're essentially a way for you to democratize access to some of these predictions, even though you don't need the data yourself and you don't need to build any proprietary models. You can also obviously make this interactive with chat conversations, but it's a way in which you can tap into these existing models and learn something about the people behind the data. More so if we think about the fact that most of the time when we try to understand and predict human behavior, we do so with the intention of influencing behavior, right? If you take any offline context, most of the time when we try to understand where someone is coming from, what they might be motivated by, what their preferences might be, we do that in a context of influence and persuasion. Any kid is really good at that, right? Any kid learns very quickly that they have to ask mom in a certain way if they want to get the candy, and then they have to ask dad in a slightly different way to optimize for success. Now, as we move to the online world, that kind of personalization got somewhat lost because it's just really difficult to do. With an LLM, again, take a ChatGPT, you can just ask it, well, just write me the short ad for an iPhone that speaks to the personality traits of openness and extroversion. Within seconds, it generates text that is not only kind of nicely tailored, but also as a consequence, much more persuasive. So we've tested this in different contexts, consumer products, political speeches. These LLMs are able to tap into the motivations and then kind of customize the content accordingly. Obviously, you can take it a step further, not just rely on text, but now also create images and video content that goes with it. And for me, that's on the one hand extremely exciting because it means that we can now use some of these insights from psychology and personality psychology specifically much more widely. But it also, as you can imagine, raises very important ethical questions that will all come back to how leaders are going to engage with these tools and use these tools. So with that, thank you so much. I recently published a book, so this is very subtle advertising here. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about my book, and it's about the employee advantage. Now you're asking, why is this guy talking about employees when, like, you know, maybe the future of employees is over and there is no work for humans left? And I'm not making any predictions on what's happening with jobs. That's this new elective we have at the business school on the future of work that it's all about. But I can make one prediction that I'm pretty certain that it's true, is that every human being will work together with a machine. So like human-machine interaction is going to be the future. That I'm almost certain about. Now, in that human-machine interaction, I think we over-indexed a lot on the technology, on the machine part. We talked a lot about machine. I mean, Sandra talked about what the machine, what those large language models can do. And I think we under-indexed on the other part, which is the human aspect. So that is what my book is basically about. And just to make sure that I'm right, here's a quote from Jeff McMillan. He's the head of firm-wide AI at Morgan Stanley, and I just wrote a case about him. He said, look, the tech is actually the easy part. The hard part is the human side. And that's what this book is all about. You know, as he said, it actually has nothing to do with AI, and then it has everything to do with AI. Because it's all about, like, in this future where humans work with machines, it's super important to be really human or employee-centric. Now, what does that mean? Now, a big analogy in the book, and in general how I think about this, is you can think about this like the employees are actually the new customers. In multiple ways. One is, you know, we saw a rise in customer centricity for a couple of reasons, because there are trends that led to those. You know, there is more innovation, there is more data, preferences change, there is more transparency about the experience, and the same trends are going to hit the labor market. The same trends will actually make the employees more important. The other is, like, we now have tools to think about what does it mean to be customer-centric. And to be customer-centric is like to personalize, to make the experience better. In order to actually charge more money, that's the whole point. And we can now apply those same tools to think about how can we make the employee experience better to create more value for the firm. Now, we're doing a terrible job so far about thinking about employees as the new customers. We looked in research how much do executives talk about customers and how much do they talk about employees. And what you see here is the ratio. So in 2007, it was about 8 times more that executives talk about customer than their employees. And it actually increases further. It goes up to like 14%. If you do text analysis, you know, we talk about our customers as like growth, opportunity is like beautiful stuff. And when we talk about our employees, it's risk, it's cost, it's a pain in the butt. That's kind of, and you not surprisingly see it in engagement level. You know, we're doing a really bad job in creating an environment which creates engaged and motivated employees. And I think we have to change that going forward, and technology can actually help. So I want to spend the rest of my talk quickly about like how can we think about AI in particular, or technology in general, how to humanize work more, how to actually create a more engaging and productive workforce. Now, in order to do that, we need to understand what motivates people at work in the first place. Why do people show up? Why are they engaged? Why are they productive? Why are they innovative? And I think the research is pretty clear. That there are 4 factors that create this. One is purpose, one is autonomy, one is competence, one is relatedness. And let me quickly go through those just to illustrate, and then I double down on one. So the first one, and this is actually what speaks for me compared to my brilliant colleagues, is those Lego movies. I show a lot of Lego movies. I made that Lego movie, actually, so very proud of it. So the first is like what I call shoot for the moon. You know, having actually a why in the organization that is motivating for everybody, you know, and it has a rocket here and says NASA, because like the famous quote of that NASA employees who said like, you know, I'm not mopping the floor, I bring a man to the moon. So it like goes through the whole organization, everybody's jazzed for that one goal to have. The second is autonomy or a matter of trust, you know, because that's the flip side, you know, remote work is part of that, where we think about like, how do we actually trust our employees, how we empower them to do their best work. And obviously in a time where we need to innovate on a very rapid scale, top-down is not working anymore. The third one is competence. I call it Just Right Task, and I'm motivated by that book, series of book here. So when my son was little, he needed to read 30 minutes a day. You know, that was required by the school. And it was, I can tell you, like it was a daily fight. Every single day. I told them, you know, dude, like just come home, read 30 minutes, you can do whatever you want. Afterwards, you can play FIFA until your eyes are squared. I mean, I don't care. And he didn't read it. I was really struggling until one day he pulled me into a bookstore, the bookstore that he would really like go around it to and he wanted to buy that series of books. So that, he was not that clever because he actually said, you know, I'm using my birthday money. I was like, well, I would have bought it. I mean, I actually bought many, many more books of them. So, and why this was the book? Because it was just right for his reading level. It was not a baby book when it was too easy, and it was not like he wanted to read Harry Potter when he was 6. He couldn't understand anything. I mean, it was just too hard. It was just right. Now, that's a very, very human trait. We want to have a task where we can master, where we can learn something, and where we can use our skills optimally. Now, obviously, that book, and he got a lot, you know, Dan Guzman got a lot of money from me, from royalties, then that became a baby book. So he needed to upgrade, and he did upgrade. He then read Stuart Gibbs' Spy School series, so he read those series. He then stopped reading, but we had a good run. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that, because what I now tell my executives that I teach, you know, now that you know that, it's easy. You know, you just find out for every of your employee, what's the just right task, match them to that task, and constantly update. And of course, they look at me as if I have like 3 heads. It's like, you know how hard that is? I mean, I have like, even if you only have 20 employees, that's hard. But I mean, many of you have like many, many more. That's really, really difficult. So let me tell you a little later what to do. Let's just finish. The last one, motivator, is like what psychologists call relatedness, kind of working together works. You know, we all played or were in good teams, sports team or not. And there is something special when it really clicks that can make like the individual, you know, the team better than like the sum of the individuals. now you know all those motivators. Now you can actually humanize the work, but I now want to think about for all of those, you can use technology to actually strengthen them. Now we don't have time to go through all of them, so let me double click on the one I mentioned, this just right task. Now first of all, we're not doing a great job on just right tasks. If you look at the stats, about 40% of employees claim their number one reason why they quit is because they're stuck. They don't learn anything more. Now, only about a quarter are actually encouraged to learn more, and about 80%, more than 80% report talent hoarding. That means their manager doesn't want them to learn more because that creates the risk that they leave. And obviously, I don't want to leave my best employee. He or she should do whatever they do over and over and over again. The problem is then they leave the organization. So now, how can we use AI to deal with that task that I told you before? Figure out for all employees, what is their just right task, match it to the right task, and update. Now, that sounds a little bit like an AI task. That's what Netflix does. Netflix figures out, Sandra, she really likes, at the moment, probably watches cartoons because of her little boy. So Netflix says, oh, Sandra, before she was watching all those violent horror movies, but now only like cartoons. Let's show her more cartoons. Eventually she will then move on from cartoons to go to nature documentaries, and then Netflix says, oh damn, Sandra now actually watches nature. Let's show her more nature documentaries. And does it very differently for me. Now, can we use that same approach within firms to create those just right tasks? And we can, and organizations now do that on large scale. So MasterCard, for example, is one that uses those, what is called internal marketplaces. What it does, it's an AI-powered tool where employees go onto the platform and say, I want to learn something new. I want to be on a project somewhere else. It matches it then with projects within MasterCard, which is obviously also good for those managers who have those projects and I need people, I don't know who, I can't hire somebody. So it matches it to those platforms, and then it learns. It will learn that I was then on a project in Germany because my HR document doesn't know that I'm actually Swiss and I speak some German. Actually pretty good. I mean, Swiss German. Anyway, so it then will know, it will learn, oh, now the platform will learn, I'm doing better, I was on that platform. It can now show me better and better of those matches going forward. By doing so, it will personalize the experience. While I was hired in the same position than Sandra was, because I know those paths, it will be a very personalized experience that has constantly updates to just right task. MasterCard started this in the pandemic, originally with an Excel spreadsheet, and now moved on to this AI-powered tool. But in a couple of weeks, I think they will reveal it in big time. They unlocked, their platform is called Unlocked, 1 million project hours. Now we can calculate how much money there is. It's a huge, huge return on investment for that firm. When I talked to the CHRO of MasterCard, Michael Fakar, he says that this internal marketplace, basically changes everything in the organization. How we think about workforce planning, democratizing, upskilling, and so on and so forth. So that's just one way where you can kind of use customer insights or tools, personalization here, for your employees. You can go much, much further. Give me another example. Amazon, a very, very customer-centric organization. When Bezos got asked, what's so great about your customer? He says, what is so great about this? They're always dissatisfied. Even when they think they're happy, they're kind of unhappy. What he means is we can always improve. We can always learn. Once we learn what that experience is of the customer, we can give an even better customer experience. Now, let's exchange customer with employees. Very few people, leaders would say, what is great about our employees, they're always dissatisfied, even when they're happy. But that's the same logic. We can actually improve now on the experience of our employees, and by doing so, having a much more engaged workforce that is also able to adapt
and take over those new technologies. So let me wrap up. So, I think like this employee-centric future of work really takes those human motivation at heart, but in order to do that, we actually need to understand what motivates people. So I think there are those 4 motivators. Then it uses technology to humanize the work even more in order to augment and support kind of what humans are actually doing to make them more valuable. And I think as a result, it will gain this employee advantage. And if you're not sick of Lego movies yet, you can watch many more in my newsletter that I send out. So, and so thank you so much for your attention.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm here to talk about tribal psychology in contemporary times. This is based on my recent book, Tribal. The subtitle is How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Bring Us Together. And I wrote this book to kind of provide a playbook for those of you who manage and lead and want to harness culture so that it's your friend rather than an obstacle. And it came because there's been a real change in how academics think about culture in different disciplines. When I was in school, a lot of classes started with the question, nature versus nurture. And if it was a biology class, the right answer was nature. And if it was a sociology class, the right answer was nurture. But that's how it was framed. But in the last decade or so, there's a new answer that a lot of consensus has formed around, which is that human nature, the nature of our species, is nurture. And what that means is that we are the animals wired to internalize the ways of the community that nurtures us and the many communities that nurture us. So we internalize multiple cultures or tribes. And that turned out to be the most important thing about our species that explains why it's so special, why it lives so differently from all the other primates and all the other animals. Early humans' brains became wired with psychological systems for learning and using culture. And that's the most important thing about us. Because of this, we began to live in tribes, larger and larger groups that were bound together by shared ideas. And that allowed the circle of trust to expand much more broadly than it does in any other primate species or any other animal species, beyond kith and kin, to total strangers who we can trust because they share our culture. They're predictable to us and thus trustworthy to us. Now, for the real evolutionary backstory about how these cultural instincts evolved and how it changed early humans and led to the modern era, you'll have to get the book, because if I start talking about that, I'll be talking for hours. But I break it down into 3 major waves of evolution. One that I call the peer instinct, where we evolved the side of us that is conformist, that pays attention to what our peers are doing and feels impelled to join them, to mesh with them. The next one I call the hero instinct. And this is the side of our psychology that wants to contribute to the community and gain status and the tribute that comes along with status. It's what we might think of as, our aspirational side, our ethical side. And then the final wave of tribal instincts that distinguishes our species came in the last 100,000 years, and it's probably the most curious of the 3. It's the ancestor instinct. It's the urge to hang on to the ways of the past. It's our extreme curiosity about what the elders are saying. It's the deep satisfaction we feel in maintaining the ways of our ancestors. And this turned out to be a really important piece of the puzzle because it created tribal memory. Once people were wired to hang on to the ways of the past, even if they didn't understand why those ways of the past were instrumentally useful, that meant that the knowledge of the past generations, the wisdom of the past, would carry forward even through periods when it wasn't used. Now, these 3 waves of tribal psychology are still with us today. There's still the psychology that explains why people adhere to the cultures of their groups, and they correspond to three basic layers that any culture will have, whether it's the culture of a society, like American culture, the culture of an industry, like engineering culture, or the culture of an organization, like CBS culture, or IBM culture, or Apple culture. Now, there's lots of nuances beyond these three major cuts, but there's a lot of leverage that you can gain if you understand the psychology involved in these three basic layers of culture. In particular, culture is dynamic. We all internalize multiple cultures, so they can't all be at the fore of our brains at the same time. So as a leader, one thing you want to do is manage cultural codes. You want to activate them. You want to bring them to the fore to create unity, to create motivation, to create coordination. Another thing you sometimes need to do as a leader is change the cultural codes. If what you need from a group is something different than they've done before, the environment has changed, you need a new strategy, you need a new culture to support that strategy, then you need to know how to engineer a new culture, how to create a shift in the culture, how to guide the evolution of the culture. And so what I'd like to do with you briefly today is just share a story with you about each of these things that illustrates how the framework of the book can show you how to manage cultural codes and to change cultural codes. Okay, for managing cultural codes, the book describes three kinds of tribal triggers. Triggers are features of the environment, the immediate situation that you're in, that bring a culture to the fore, that bring it to the front of your mind. And the triggers associated with these three layers of culture, I call tribal signs, symbols, and ceremonies. Now, that's very abstract, and it's best to just illustrate it with a story, something close to home that you guys will understand. My story here comes from an event about 10 or 12 years ago when then-time Dean Glenn Hubbard came to me and said, "Michael, you're the culture expert on the faculty. I think we've got a cultural problem, which is that we have this estimable tradition of Columbia Business School, but it doesn't seem to be in the fore of people's minds. It's not the identity that people think about all the time, both the students and the faculty." We had a funny thing in alumni surveys at around that time where when we would ask alumni, how do you feel about Columbia Business School? You know, it was positive, but it was like 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10. We weren't getting like the 9 out of 10 that we wanted. But then if we asked a different question, how do you feel about those 2 years of your life when you were doing your MBA? 9 out of 10. You know, so people had no second thoughts, no reservations about having come to Columbia Business School, but they somehow weren't giving Columbia Business School credit for how much fun and how much they learned during those 2 years. So the Columbia identity needed to be more central. Similarly for the faculty, we were in these little silos of the management division, the marketing division, the accounting division, and we didn't think much about Columbia Business School as an identity. So I was part of a task force with one person from each division, and we spent about a year analyzing the problem, and we saw many sides of the problem. But basically, what we concluded was the problem was the environment. Students were on the main campus, lost in the crowd, mixed in with students of every variety. The only cultural symbols around were these somewhat cryptic objects. You know, the one symbol, the intentional symbol was the Hermes symbol, but most people thought it was a 4, you know, because they didn't know what the Hermes was, and some people were pronouncing it like the French tie company rather than Hermes. So it's not Hermes, it's Hermes, you know. But we didn't have really salient symbols. And as for ceremonies, there was no room to have ceremonies like the one that we're at today. We had to have those on other locations. So I suggested to the dean the best solution was to wait and then make a big push for cultural change when we had a change of campus. We could reset the culture when we moved to this wonderful new campus. So now we're here, and we have this amazing building that has won awards. and that symbolizes some of the ideals that we want to be central to the culture. So it's one of the most advanced climate progressive buildings in New York City. It's won awards for that, and that's climate change is now one of the pillars of the Columbia identity. It's a differentiator. And we designed the buildings around central staircases so that the MBA students see almost every other MBA student every day, because these staircases are conduits for the whole community to go through. So what we've achieved is that our MBA students are now surrounded by their fellow MBA peers. They are constantly exposed to symbols of what we stand for, an innovative and climate change friendly building. And they are frequently exposed to ceremonial events like this one that stir the traditional feelings that are also part of a culture. And if you want to understand a little more about what I'm saying, you're going to have to read the book, because I don't have time to go into all of it. But I do want to share the second story with you in my final 5 minutes, and that is, how can an organization change the culture? Sometimes organizations have to change their internal culture, but what's even harder is when a company realizes it needs to change the popular culture around it. It needs to change the culture of the customers. It's not enough to have a good technology. You have to have norms for using the technology, and so companies have to be cultural entrepreneurs sometimes and change the culture. An example of this, and I'm going to argue that you can change cultures through sending tribal signals, and three really important kinds for the three kinds of cultural codes are prevalence signals, prestige signals, and precedent signals. Prevalence signals are signaling that something is widespread. Prestige signals are signaling that something is associated with status. And precedent signals are signaling that something is established, that it's part of a tradition. It's something that the past generations have done. So my example here is a company that we all remember, Kodak. You know, it was one of the prominent companies of the 20th century. And at the start of the 20th century, Kodak had a near monopoly on film for amateur cameras. But they faced a cultural barrier, which is that at the time, people felt that portraits were a serious matter, a kind of grim affair, best left to the professional photographers in their studios. And the professional photographers had a custom at the time of asking the sitters to say the word prunes, leading to photographs like this one. And if you have photographs of your ancestors like that, you may have sometimes formed the impression that, wow, these were grim people. You know, I'm relieved that I never met them in person. But they actually weren't so grim. The Victorians weren't such grim people. It's just that the first cameras had a very slow shutter speed, which required sitters to hold their face perfectly still for over a minute. And you can't do that with a smile. So they just decided we would get people to hold a serious expression by saying the word prunes. But like the QWERTY keyboard and many other social conventions, it perpetuated, and it lasted as a tradition even after cameras advanced to the point where they could hold a fleeting smile. So what did Kodak do? They launched a long-running campaign across several decades. They created a camera called the Brownie that was user-friendly. It was kind of like the first Macintosh, but it was a camera. And they made it a loss leader. They sold it for $1, and they also gave it away to college campuses, to YMCAs, to scout troops, so that young, enthusiastic people would be out in the parks taking pictures of each other. Kodak also created magazines where they perpetuated terms like shutterbug and snapshot, so people could understand this idea of amateur photography. And they had slogans like, "Save your happy family memories with a snapshot," making parents feel that it was the right thing to do. It was the prestigious thing to do. Americans started seeing more and more smiling faces. They also involved Hollywood celebrities, and celebrities like aviatrix and Columbia alumni Amelia Earhart who was a big smiler. So people started seeing high prestige people smiling. And the final coup de grace was that Kodak sponsored school pictures and the custom of saying cheese, which was a novelty, saying cheese instead of saying prunes. And so the result is captured in this results of a study where they took a composite photo of high school yearbooks from a bunch of American high schools across all the decades of the 20th century. And you can see that the dead eyes and the pressed lips of the early decades become replaced by subtle grins and then eventually full-blown smiles and twinkling eyes. And now we have an epidemic of smiling that even shows up in mugshots. We've had some recent stories about this should be an unhappy event, but people are smiling, even relatively smart people like Bill Gates, politicians, but not everyone smiles. You know, we can still, if we try hard, we can still not smile. So that gives you a flavor of the book. It has won the attention of critics, but the attention that matters is yours. People buy books when their friends tell them it's interesting, so please help spread the word. You can scan this to the book's website. Thanks so much for your attention. It's great to see you all back.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I don't have a book. That's the most important thing to say to all of you. But you know, as I was thinking about this talk, I was also thinking about a few alternative titles to this talk, because the way that I could have titled this talk was perhaps who is the most important person in your organization, or the most important person in your friend group, your family, and the College of Cardinals. What? Okay, so important question to all of you. Who has been on a chicken farm before? Has anyone been on a chicken farm? Okay. Y'all are lying. I don't believe that this many people in the room has been on a chicken farm before. If you have never been on a chicken farm before, this is what a chicken farm looks like. And if you've never seen a TikTok, then welcome to your first TikTok. That's what a TikTok looks like here. What's really interesting about chicken farms is that you get to notice the way that chickens socialize. And scientists have actually looked at this. In fact, scientists have noticed that chickens socialize in a very peculiar way. They happen to socialize in terms of what they call triads. What a triad is it's just a triangle. So if you go around a chicken farm, you'll notice that all chickens are doing are moving around from triangle to triangle to triangle to triangle. But it's not just that, because what they're also doing is that they're socializing in these threes in a certain way. They do what are called forming dominance hierarchies. So if you've ever heard the term pecking order before, that's what chickens are doing when they're socializing in these triads. They're trying to determine who is the king chicken. They're trying to determine who's the second chicken and who is the loser chicken. You know, that's what they're trying to do. And that's all a chicken farm ultimately is, if you leave them at their own to socialize. It turns out that all animals have their own signatures when it comes to the way that they socialize. And furthermore, those signatures, when you look at them from a bird's eye point of view, have their own markings. And those markings are in the patterns that they form in their social networks. And so, for example, chickens form these dominance hierarchies when they socialize in groups of three. Rhesus monkeys are also similarly hierarchical. Giraffes are clustered. They look the closest to what my colleague, Professor Morris, was talking about in terms of tribes. Guppies are cohesive, and orcas, killer whales, they tend to be modular. They move in different pods. In fact, that is the name of venery for an orca, pods. And so this all makes sense. It turns out that humans also have a unique social signature when it comes to their social networks. And they form what are called small world networks. Now that's a term that I bet most of you have heard about before. So what's a small world networks? Well, if you ever encounter a person and you realize that you have a coworker, a friend, a family member, or somebody in common, well, then you have realized the phenomenon of being in a small world network. And I'll tell you exactly why that is. Because as humans, what we tend to do is to gravitate toward people with whom we already have relationships or with whom we're similar. And so we form these little clusters. But unlike giraffes, what we also have are certain members in our clusters who also go between clusters. They're members of different clusters. And those individuals are called brokers. And so the reason why it happens more often than not that you actually meet somebody with whom you have someone in common, that's because you're talking to a broker. And the most famous broker that I can think about in Hollywood is this person. So Kevin Bacon, I'm sure you've all heard of this game before, but this was a popular game in which you would try to see which actor was paired with other actor based on the movies that they've in, and chances are that pathway from movie to movie, actor to actor, would flow through Kevin Bacon. Why is that? Because Kevin Bacon, of course, was overworked, but also because Kevin Bacon starred in a lot of movies that crossed different genres. And so he was embedded in different clusters. What's unique about that position, the person that's known as a broker, is that they have an advantage. In fact, they have an advantage in 4 ways. And so I'm going to take you through the 4 ways in which brokers have an advantage in life, but also in organizations. The first thing I'm going to tell you about is that brokers are more innovative. There's so many statistics about this. People who cross different social circles tend to be more creative. They tend to generate more patents. They tend to draw things that are more out of the ordinary as well. But my favorite example of this is the following. So those of you in the room who have had me as a professor in class in strategy or technology strategy class know that I'm a huge foodie. But there's one restaurant that I never got to try, and that is because it no longer exists. This person is Ferran Adria. And Ferran Adria is the proprietor and chef of a restaurant called El Bulli. Now, El Bulli was located in the northeast coast of Spain, not far from Barcelona, and El Bulli was famous for launching the gastronomical revolution. What does that refer to? Well, it's an innovative movement in cuisine and culinary sciences in which you saw creative dishes that looked nothing like had come before. And so Ferran Adria pioneered this. People waited for years on the wait list just to have an opportunity to drive 3 hours from Barcelona to go to El Bulli. If you have been there at El Bulli, I want to talk to you. I want to interview you about the experience. Because what you would have eaten if you had the opportunity to go to El Bulli was this. This is an example of a dish, spaghetto parmesan. And the dish is based on, well, spaghetti. But what you see on the right-hand side of the slide is El Bulli's interpretation of spaghetti with tomato sauce. It's a single strand that has been decomposed and recomposed into something that's entirely new. And the question, of course, is how did Ferran Adria come up with this? And the answer is that he did not come up with this. The answer comes in the organization of his kitchen. This is what a typical restaurant back-of-the-house kitchen looks like. You have a chef, executive chef, chef de cuisine, you have different stations. And the way that this kitchen is designed is it's designed for efficiency, for incremental innovation and improvement, and also for user-based innovation. And so stuff and feedback comes in from the customers, and we build that into the dishes. In fact, most restaurants today are organized like this. But not El Bulli. This was Ferran Adria's genius. What he realized was that in order to be innovative, your organization also has to look different as well. So he took the classic kitchen brigade structure, and he did one thing that was different. He imposed on that structure something called a creative development station. And staffed at this creative development station were chefs. The task of these chefs, who worked in all other parts of the kitchen, is that they had to spend at least 1 day a week working in other areas outside of restaurants. This could be a skateboard shop, this could be a hotel, this could be in fashion, and they would bring it back with them the rest of the week in order to infuse what they learned into the dishes that they would create that week. And for that reason, those folks who were part of that creative development station were these brokers, these necessary folks who absorbed ideas from other social circles and other social clusters. The other thing about brokers is that not only are they innovative, but when they have innovative ideas, they're considered to be better. So this is a study that was done about 15 years ago, and it was done at a huge telecom company in the United States. And what this scholar did is that they interviewed 670 managers at this organization. And what they asked the managers to do is to come up with ideas to improve the functioning of the organization. And those ideas would then be evaluated by the executive team of the organization. And then there was an analysis. Who came up with the best ideas? And I'm going to show you the results. The best ideas had nothing to do with the managerial rank of the person. It had nothing to do with how long they spent at the company. It had nothing to do with their highest degree. Didn't matter whether you were a high school dropout, had a PhD, 2 PhDs, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter which region you were from. You would think that people in New York have the best ideas. Nope, not at this company. Functional role also doesn't matter. The people who had the worst ideas, which is most of the managers involved, however, had a network within their company that looked like this. They were sat at the center, and they talked to people who also talked a lot to one another. The managers who were judged to have the best ideas had social networks that looked like this. They spanned different groups. The folks who they talked to did not talk to one another. And the result is that they had a greater sampling of visibility into the ideas and problems that needed to be addressed. And so brokers have better ideas. The other thing is that brokers also get more famous. They're more viral. And I'm so proud to show you some research that was done by some of our colleagues in our division here. So you don't have to reveal yourself here, but I'm going to show you two paintings. So these two paintings, some of you might recognize immediately. If there's a person who is 100% sure who painted at least one of these paintings, I'd like you to shout that artist's name out. Who do you think that is? George Brock. That is fascinating. That's never happened to me before. Who would you have said? Picasso. Who's heard of Picasso? Who's heard of George Brock? Not that many folks. So are you sure which one is which? They're nearly indistinguishable. You think the right. What is your name? The one on the right. B? What is your name? Oh my God, can we prepare a prize? Actually, Susan got it right. My God. Okay, so these two paintings look almost identical, but they were painted by different people. The two people they were painted by were Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. They were contemporaries, and they were friends. They spent a lot of time together. And so it's pretty obvious why they would develop similar styles. But of course, one thing is that we know that Picasso is way more famous than Braque. Like, hardly anyone here knew who Braque was. If you're an art aficionado, perhaps you know who he is. In fact, if you go to the MoMA today, you will see paintings of Picasso placed alongside paintings of Braque as well. So what explains their fame? Well, a few colleagues of ours did a study to look at what shaped these artists' social networks at the turn of the 20th century. In fact, the visualization and analysis that they developed is actually on display at the MoMA right now, so you can actually see it. It's an exhibit called Inventing Abstraction, and it was done using data from correspondence letters between expressionist artists at the turn of the 20th century. Guess who's right at the middle? It's Pablo Picasso. And the reason why is not just that he sent letters to many different other artists and gallerists, but he also sent letters to folks who never sent letters to one another. And that is an explanation of why Picasso ultimately became way more famous than Braque. So we've gone through why brokers are more innovative. We know why they have better ideas. We know that they are more viral as well. But finally, we're going to talk about something that all of you came to business school, which is why brokers make more money. And it is true. They do make more money. They create more value. If you notice in the title slide that I sent all of you, there was this blurry photo of these folks sitting in the title slide. Here's that title slide. I'm going to sharpen that focus so that you can see who these folks are. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's not obvious to me who these folks are, but I know. I created the slide, so of course I know. So these folks are known as the PayPal Mafia. So who are the PayPal Mafia? Here's the PayPal Mafia. These are folks who are involved in either investing in PayPal when it first started or founding PayPal when it first started. You'll notice that there's one person who's not named here. It's because when they staged this photo for a magazine, the bar owner insisted that he would be in the photo. And so that's him right there. Nobody knows his name. He did not invest in PayPal. One of the companies that the PayPal Mafia later went on to invest in was Airbnb. And in fact, the PayPal Mafia did many investments together. They co-invested together in the past. They also co-invested for many years after PayPal as well. So I want you to put yourself in the position of a founder like Brian Chesky, who is the founder of Airbnb. And let's say you had the luxury of having the following choice. You could take funding from the PayPal Mafia, knowing that all of those investors had invested together before, or you had the option of taking investment from an equivalent group of people, but who had never invested together before. Whose funding would you take? And this was the basis of a research question that we looked at a few years ago. Because to me, the answer is not obvious. On the one hand, having a group of folks invest in your company who are cohesive means that they work well together. But they also might do what? Gang up against you. If you take money from a group of people who have never invested together, you get a broader sampling of their opinions. But they might not be able to coordinate with one another. So what do we find? I'll tell you what we find. We find that if you take money from a group of investors who have never really worked together before, compared to a group of investors who have worked together before, then the eventuality of your exit outcome is the following. You have a 37% higher probability of going public. But if you take money from a group of investors who have worked together before extensively, you have a 6% higher probability of being acquired. So you're telling yourself, well, it's obvious. Take money from the group of investors who've never worked together before. The thing is, if you take money from that group, you also have a 50% higher probability of exiting by failure as well. So it's a high-risk, high-reward strategy, which brings us to our new pope. What is distinct about our new pope? Well, it turns out a group of researchers at the University of Coney analyzed the social network of the College of Cardinals. And what they discovered is that Robert Prevost from Chicago, Illinois, happened to be right at the center of that network. And not only was he distinct in this network, but he happened to span different social clusters as well. And so it's that act of being situated as a broker is what predicted his ascendancy to being a pope. So if you want to be a pope and go public, be a broker. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to share with you a story of two people, two captains of vessels that both dealt with the exact same crisis, a hole in those vessels. And what I'm going to use to illustrate how these two different captains responded to this unbelievable crisis that they experienced suddenly tells us a lot about leadership and a lot about inspiration. So let me start off with the first of these leaders, a woman named Tammy Jo Schultz. She was flying Southwest Airlines 1380 from LaGuardia, New York to Dallas, Texas, when the left engine exploded and tore a hole in the side of her plane. Now, in that moment, a lot of things happened. One thing that happened is a passenger, unfortunately, was sucked fatally into that hole. Obviously, cabin pressure fell, but hydraulic lines were also cut, fuel lines were cut. She was dealing with an incredible, unscripted level of crises simultaneously. And she discovered pretty quickly that the plane wanted to descend, and so she let it descend. And her co-captain suggested going to Philadelphia, and they ended up landing in Philadelphia. And I'm going to show you right now is a very, very, very short clip of her communication with air traffic controllers.
Southwest 1380. I understand your emergency. Let me know when you want to go in.
Yeah, we have a part of the aircraft missing, so we're going to need to slow down a bit.
Southwest 1380. Speed is your discretion. Maintain at any altitude above 3,000 feet, and you let me know when you want to turn base.
All right. Down to 3,000. Okay, could you have the medical meet us there on the runway as well? We've got injured passengers.
Injured passengers, okay. And is your airplane physically on fire?
No, it's not on fire, but part of it's missing. They said there was a hole and someone went out.
I'm sorry, you said there was a hole and somebody went out? Southwest 1380, it doesn't matter. We'll work it out there. So the airport's just off to your right. Reported in sight, please.
Southwest 1380, airport's in sight.
Southwest 1380, runway 27 left, clear to land. Southwest 1380, right turn when you're able. If you want to stop wherever you need to is fine.
Thank you. We're going to stop right here by the fire truck. Thanks, guys, for the help.
So if you were to use one word to describe her voice, I think we would all agree that the word would be calm. She is incredibly calm. And her calm voice mattered not just in communicating with the air traffic controllers, but I mentioned before that she realized pretty quickly that the plane wanted to descend, and she let it descend. Now that plane dropped 20,000 feet in less than 5 minutes. But she did something really, really remarkable during that descent, is she recognized the experience of her passengers. If you are a passenger back there and you have a hole in your plane and you're going down 20,000 feet pretty quickly, what do you think you're going to do? You're going to crash. So she got on the plane, on the intercom, and she said 10 words that everyone said was utterly transformative, taking from like heart attack level panic to hope and possibility. And those 10 words were, we're not going down, we're going to Philly. And what she did in that moment is she helped people make sense of their experience. She gave them a sense of understanding that this descent had a purpose rather than a free fall. Now, the other thing that Tammy Jo Schultz did when they landed, which is also pretty remarkable, is she went row by row and just checked in on every passenger. And she said later on, she said, I'm a little shocked that my stroll down the aisle got more national attention than the incredible skill it took to land this crippled plane. Tells us something really important. Now, I'm going to tell you about another captain named Francesco Schettino, and some of you may have heard of him. And he got too close to shore one day on a Mediterranean cruise and tore a 150-foot hole in his particular vessel. Now, what's also remarkable about this is he claims he got so close to shore to salute some mariners. Prosecutors claim it was to impress his mistress, a Moldovan dancer. But what isn't controversial is what happened next, which is nothing. He didn't do anything for an hour. He spent the next hour trying to figure out what story he was going to tell. In the end, 32 people perished because of his delay. Now, I'm going to show you a little clip of him talking to the Coast Guard. Now, what's particularly interesting about him talking to the Coast Guard is he's in a lifeboat at the time he's talking. He's not on his ship anymore. Now, he claims he tripped and fell into the lifeboat, remarkably. He also did one of these other amazing things where he tripped and fell out of his uniform into civilian clothing. And so you can hear them talking now to him.
Lei sale su quella biscagina e va a bordo della nave. Va a bordo della nave e mi viene a dire, mi riporta quante persone ci sono. Le è chiaro? Io sto registrando questa comunicazione, comandante Schettino. In questo momento la nave è inclinata. Ho capito. C'è gente, ascolti, c'è gente che sta scendendo dalla biscagina di prua. Lei quella biscagina la percorre in senso inverso, sale sulla nave e mi dice quante persone e che cosa hanno a bordo, chiaro? Mi dice se ci sono bambini, donne o persone bisognose di assistenza e me ne dice il numero di ciascuna di queste categorie. È chiaro? Guardi Schettino che lei si è salvato forse dal mare, ma io la porto veramente molto male, faccio passare l'anima dei guai. Vado a bordo.
So you can hear real infuriation in the Coast Guard DeFalco's voice, right? I'm going to make you pay. And Schettino did pay. He spent many years in prison for dereliction of duty, manslaughter, et cetera. And I want you now to think about a Schultz in your life and a Schettino in your life. So someone who inspired you, changed you inside, created this wellspring of hope and possibility, and someone who infuriated you, creating a seething cauldron of rage and resentment. And I've asked tens of thousands of people this question across the world. And I'm going to give you 5 big insights or 5 big ideas from my research in the next 5 minutes. So here's the first one. Inspiring and infuriating leaders exist on an enduring continuum that is made up of 3 universal factors. I'm going to break that down to it. First is this idea that there is this continuum, right? So we have a Schultz who's courageous versus cowardly, right? Selfless versus selfish, right? Sees the big picture, lost in the weeds. So we can start to see that what I discovered in asking tens of thousands of people is that the inspiring leader and the infuriating leader are mirror images of each other. Now, the second part of what I just told you is I said that they are universal. That is, there is not a single characteristic that inspires or infuriates that's not mentioned in every single country in the world. And the third thing is that there's 3 universal factors. And these are being visionary, how we see the world, being exemplar, how we are in the world, our presence, and then being a mentor, how we interact in the world. And I'm going to give you a little mnemonic device so you can remember this, called the Venn diagram of inspiring leadership. Now, here's the second big idea. Why are there 3 universal factors? It's because each one of them satisfy a fundamental human need. Being visionary satisfies the need for meaning and understanding. That's what Tammy Jo Schultz gave her passengers, a sense of understanding, right? Being exemplar satisfies the need for protection and passion, that sense that people are safe. And being a mentor means satisfying that need for, I belong, I'm included, but I'm also valued and I'm respected. So I'm going to just tell you very briefly about each one of these dimensions. I'm just going to give you kind of a quote. Here's a quote that really captures what it means to be visionary, right? People who have a why to live can bear almost any how. You can suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune if you know why you're doing something. So inspiring leaders give us an optimistic why. They help people make sense of their experience and provide meaning for their experience. We're not going down, we're going to Philly. Now, exemplars, how we are in the world, do a couple different things, but one of them is they embody their vision. They're not hypocrites. Hypocrites are the most infuriating leaders of them all. They activate the rage centers of the brain. But as we saw with Tammy Jo Schultz, they're also calm and courageous protectors. So here are 2 very similar people. Bubalina from Greece, she led the independence of Greece. George Washington led the independence of America. And look how similar these paintings are. Where's their boat? It's the lead boat. What are they doing in the boat? They're standing up in the boat. They're taking on the most risk. And third is mentor. And I love this quote from Confucius. It really captures this idea. Tell me, and I will forget. Show me, and I may remember. But it's only when you involve me that I truly understand. And so inspiring mentors empower and elevate others. And if we really think of this continuum again, right, we have involving others versus micromanagers. They're so infuriating. Or people that share credit, elevate others, versus steal credit and claim it. One of the most infuriating things that happens if you do employee surveys is people stealing their ideas. So we have the Venn diagram of inspiring leadership. Now, the third big idea, and this gets back to something that Michael talked about in nature versus nurture, is that inspiring leaders aren't just born, they can be made. What I've established in my research is that there's a universal set of attributes, characteristics, and behaviors, and because of that, they can be identified, they can be practiced, and they can be developed. And I don't have time to go through all of these right now, but these are sort of the different ones. The fourth big idea is that as a leader, the Venn diagram really matters because you really matter. Neutrality is not an option. You don't have a choice of whether you impact people when you're a leader. You will inspire or you will infuriate. And to highlight this, I'm going to tell you a story about my first day in graduate school in 1993 with Danny Kahneman, who is the only psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics. It's my first day, 11 graduate students. I'm intimidated by their brain power. Finally get a chance. I think I'm going to say something insightful. I raise my hand, and I still remember the 4 things Danny did that day. Crossed his arms, shook his head, scrunched up his face, and he said, "That's not right at all." Now, Danny moved on, and the rest of the class did, but I was frozen in place. It took me weeks. Those words reverberated inside of me to speak up. But about 6 weeks later, I saw Danny in the hallway. And Danny, without stopping his stroll down the hallway, just turned over his shoulder and said, "Hey, Adam, I love reading your reflection papers. You're a great writer." And I was so filled with so much joy and energy, I literally just started skipping down the hallway. And I coined a phrase to capture these 2 very different Danny Kahneman experiences that represent the exact same concept, the leader amplification effect. When we are in a position of leadership, we have a bigger, our signals get amplified, our impact gets greater, and the reactions get intensified. They grow essentially in style. And to give you just one example of this other example of leader amplification, someone told me a story recently where they said, their boss said to them, "Come by my office Tuesday at 3 p.m., I need to talk to you." Now, this was Thursday. They said on Thursday, "Come by my office at 3 p.m., I need to talk to you." She did not sleep for 5 days. It's like, oh my God, am I losing people? Am I losing my job? Did I do something wrong? And then she met him at 3 p.m. on Tuesday. And he said, oh, yes, I just want to go over the agenda for Friday's meeting. And think about that. If he had said, come by my office Tuesday at 3 p.m., we can go over Friday's agenda, they're both 13 words. It would have cost him nothing. So one of the things that we need to do as leaders is to recognize that we are leaders, that we have power, that our signals are amplified, that we're going to have this impact. And once we become aware of that, we can start to recognize little things like telling the person why we want to meet with them can be somehow transformative for them. So this is the Venn diagram of inspiring leadership that I presented. And I'm going to end with the 5th big idea. And this is, how do we take this and make this an everyday part of our experience to be more inspiring? And I'm going to use a phrase called reap what you sow. Now this comes from the Bible, right? Reap what you sow is the idea that the energy we put out in the world is the energy we get back. If we put out inspiring energy into the world, we're going to receive inspiring energy back. But if we put inferior energy, we're going to get inferior energy back. So what is reap what you sow? Notice that mine is spelled differently because it's an acronym. And it's going to begin with reflection. We should reflect on our experiences of when we've been inspiring and when maybe we've been infuriating, and how we might move ourselves from the continuum of infuriation to the other side of inspiration. The second thing is periodically do what I asked you to do earlier. Think of a Schultz in your life, person that inspires you. What could you do to embody or emulate those behaviors? And then you can take those reflections and those emulations and you can turn them into intentions. And then you can turn those intentions into practice. And so here's my final slide and my final thought for you is you can inspire others. Now you may wonder, why do I have a coffee cup up there? Because I'm going to tell you a little story about a CEO told me recently after learning about my ideas. He said, I actually made what I call my coffee commitment or my coffee compliment. Every morning now, over my cup of coffee, I'll send out a text or an email to someone in my orbit and either praise them for a job well done or express gratitude or thanks for something they did to help me. It might be something like simple, hey, I was thinking about that presentation you gave last week and just how you really hit it out of the park, or that report that we finished, I couldn't have done it without your help. And he told me 3 really interesting things about it. The first thing he said is he quickly discovered that sending a compliment over text is better than sending a compliment in person. Now that seems surprising, right? We're always told to do things in person. He said, when I compliment people in person, they get embarrassed. They're like, oh, okay, yeah, you know? But he said, when I compliment them over text, I discovered that they savor it. One person said, I read your text 5 times over the weekend. They get to share it. Someone else said, I shared it with my mom who was in the hospital and she was so thrilled, right? And the third thing he gets is rather than embarrassed reactions, he gets these glowing, effusive responses back. And he said, here's the shocking thing for me. I started doing my coffee compliments to put a skip in their step. But in the end, it put a skip in my step. So I call on all of you to think of one thing that you can do each day to be a little bit more inspiring so that you can put a skip in other people's steps. And if you do, you're going to spread the seeds of inspiration and you're going to put a skip in your own step. Thank you so much.